The cold, dark night of September 15, 1485, was unlike any other in Saragossa. The city, usually humming with life, was eerily quiet. Inside the grand cathedral, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the soft glow of candles. Pedro Arbués, a man of God, knelt before the high altar, his head bowed in prayer. Unbeknownst to him, a group of 8 men crept silently through the shadows, their faces obscured by the darkness. They were here for one reason: to end the Inquisitor's life. Arbués, a man known for his unwavering faith and his stern judgment, sensed something was amiss. He shifted slightly, his hand instinctively reaching for the coat of mail hidden beneath his gown and the steel cap on his head. But it was too late. One of the men stepped forward, a long, sharp dagger in hand. With a swift, deadly stroke, he plunged the blade into Arbués's back. The Inquisitor gasped, the air escaping his lungs in a painful wheeze. 2 more men joined in, their daggers leaving deep, crimson wounds. Arbués staggered, his body weak from the loss of blood, and collapsed to the floor. The cathedral's canons rushed to the scene, their eyes wide with horror. They found Arbués, a man who had been revered and feared, lying in a pool of his own blood, his life slipping away. 24 hours later, on September 17th, the Inquisitor breathed his last. The news of Arbués's murder sent shockwaves through Saragossa and the entire kingdom of Aragon. The once quiet city erupted into chaos. Arbués was quickly declared a saint, and his blood, believed to have healing powers, became a symbol of divine retribution. Mobs roamed the streets, their anger directed at the conversos, former Jews who had converted to Christianity, but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faith. The fueros, the laws that granted Aragonese citizens certain rights and protections, were suspended as the search for the assassins intensified. In the days that followed, the Inquisition, now more powerful than ever, held its first auto de fe, a public ritual of penance for those accused of heresy. The killers of Arbués were among the first to face the Inquisitor's wrath. One of them had his hands cut off and nailed to the door of the Deputation, the city's governing body. His mutilated body was then dragged to the marketplace, where he was beheaded and quartered, his remains displayed as a warning to others. Another assassin, unable to face his fate, took his own life by breaking a glass lamp and swallowing the shards. Even in death, he suffered the same brutal punishment. But the Inquisition's reach extended far beyond the assassins. The conspirators were not just any men. They were part of the highest circles of Aragonese society. Conversos, many of whom held influential positions, were accused of plotting the murder. Among them were Gabriel Sanchez, the king's treasurer, and Sancho Paternoi, the royal treasurer in Aragon. These men, once powerful and respected, now found themselves at the mercy of the Inquisitors. The trial and punishment of the conspirators were swift and brutal. Francisco de Santa Fe, son of the famous converso Geronimo, committed suicide by jumping from a tower. His remains were burned in a public auto de fe. Sancho Paternoi was tortured and imprisoned. Louis Santangel, a renowned military leader, was beheaded and his body burned in the marketplace. His cousin, another Louis Santangel, who had financed Christopher Columbus's voyages, was forced to do public penance. The once great families of Santa Fe, Santangel, Caballeria, and Sanchez were devastated, their names forever tarnished by the events of that fateful night. The murder of Pedro Arbués marked a turning point in the history of Aragon. It silenced the voices of those who opposed the Inquisition and strengthened the crown's control over the eastern realms. The conversos, who had hoped to protect their rights and their way of life, found themselves facing a relentless and unforgiving enemy. The Inquisition, now firmly established, would continue to wield its power, shaping the destiny of Aragon and all who lived within its borders. Ferdinand, the King of Aragon, faced a challenging time. After the chaos of civil wars, he was trying to gain more control over his kingdom. He often talked about how important the Inquisition was, but he was smart enough to know that he couldn't use it to get too much power. He also knew that the conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity were a powerful group he couldn't mess with. They had supported him from the beginning, and he returned the favor by protecting them. In 1478, the Inquisition started its work in Mallorca, an island where many Jews had been forced to convert. The Inquisition found a lot of work to do, dealing with people who were still practicing Jewish traditions in secret. The inquisitors, Pedro Arbués de Munebrãga and Sancho Marin, were very busy from 1488 to 1491. The island was mostly peaceful, but some people complained that the inquisitors were getting involved in things that weren't their business. They said the inquisitors were taking over cases that didn't involve heresy, and were letting people with bad reputations carry weapons. Despite these complaints, there were no major uprisings until much later. In 1488, the Inquisition began its work in other parts of Aragon and in some cities in Castile. This was a time when both conversos and Jews were facing a lot of trouble. Jews were being forced to leave their homes, and conversos were being punished for any signs of Jewish practices. Many conversos fled the country, not because they wanted to leave the Catholic faith, but because they were scared of the Inquisition. The Inquisition focused mainly on one thing: finding people who were secretly practicing Jewish traditions. They used something called the Edict of Grace to get information. The inquisitors would give a sermon, list heresies, and invite people to come forward and admit their sins. If they did, they would be forgiven and not punished too badly. Many conversos came forward not because they were practicing Judaism, but because they were afraid of what might happen if they didn't. They were often scared that someone might lie about them. In cities like Toledo and Seville, thousands of conversos came forward to be reconciled with the church. They were given penances and sometimes had to pay money to the Inquisition. This money was a way for the Inquisition to make some income, and for the conversos to avoid more serious punishments. Even though they were reconciled, many conversos still felt humiliated and lived in constant fear. The Inquisition was very strict, and many people were punished. Some were burned at the stake, but most of the executions were of people who had already fled. The inquisitors would burn effigies, dummy figures of these absent people. Despite the high numbers of people being investigated, the actual number of executions was not as high as some people thought. In the first 30 years of the Inquisition, it's estimated that around 2,000 people were executed for heresy. The Inquisition had a big impact on the conversos, who were a significant part of the population. Many of them were important in business, administration, and the professions. As they were persecuted and forced to leave, it hurt the local economy. In cities like Barcelona and Valencia, the number of conversos dropped dramatically, and the remaining ones were often in financial trouble. This loss of conversos was more damaging to the economy than the later expulsion of the Jews, who were already a smaller and less influential group. The fear and persecution led some conversos to return to their Jewish roots. They started practicing Jewish traditions again, not because they had always wanted to, but because they felt they had no other choice. It was a difficult time, and many people's lives were changed forever by the Inquisition. In the 15th century, the Inquisition in Spain was a powerful and often feared institution. Some historians argue that the main reason for its establishment was not religious zeal, but a desire to eliminate conversos, or converted Jews, from positions of influence in public life. The idea was that by targeting these conversos, the Inquisition and the Crown could seize their wealth and property, enriching themselves in the process. This theory makes sense if you believe that there wasn't a widespread movement among conversos to return to Jewish practices. However, the situation was more complex. King Ferdinand, for example, publicly denied any hostility towards conversos and continued to employ them in his service. In 1507, he declared, "We have always had these people, like any others, in our service, and they have served us well. My intention always has been and still is that the good among them be rewarded and the bad punished, though charitably and not harshly." This suggests that not all conversos were seen as enemies of the state. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, certainly wanted Spain to be united in faith, but there's no evidence of a deliberate plan to enforce religious uniformity. For many years, they protected their Jewish subjects while trying to stop conversos from practicing Jewish customs. Even after the Jews were expelled in 1492, Muslims in Spain were allowed to practice their religion freely for several more decades. The Inquisition's records, compiled by its own officials, often paint a biased picture. People who fled or came forward for rehabilitation were automatically considered guilty. Those who were found guilty and punished were seen as rightly judged. The Inquisition's chroniclers accepted the Jewish background of conversos as a historical fact without much questioning. However, the trial documents tell a different story. Many conversos accused of practicing Judaism were charged based on gossip, personal grudges, and old rumors. For example, a man might be accused because a neighbor remembered him changing his sheets on a Friday, 30 years ago. Such flimsy evidence wouldn't hold up in a modern court. One case involved a man named Sancho de Ciudad, who was accused of Jewish practices based on events from 20 to 30 years earlier. Another, Juan de Chinchilla, was burned at the stake based on evidence from 16 and 20 years ago, even though his current neighbors testified that he appeared to be a practicing Catholic. The inquisitors often accepted incredible feats of memory as reliable evidence. They would believe witnesses who claimed to remember specific actions from decades ago, while ignoring more recent, contradictory testimony. This led to many unjust trials and punishments. Some of those convicted of practicing Judaism were accused by family members, which might seem plausible but often involved personal conflicts. Others were convicted in absentia, without a fair trial, and their property was seized. Many were convicted based on hearsay from neighbors who had to recall events from a long time ago. After 1492, the situation changed. Many Jews converted to Christianity to avoid expulsion, and some who had left Spain later returned and converted. These new converts often regretted their decision and longed for their former Jewish lives. They were more likely to practice Judaism in secret, leading to more genuine cases of Judaizing. This created new challenges for the Inquisition. In the 1480s, they relied on edicts of grace and voluntary confessions to gather evidence. After 1492, they had a wealth of accumulated testimonies and the help of some conversos who wanted to get back at the Jews who had denounced them earlier. Despite the Inquisition's efforts, many people in Spain, especially in Catalonia, bore ill will towards it and would have liked to see it abolished. The Inquisition's popularity was not universal, and its impact was limited to urban areas for many years. Most Spaniards living in rural areas had little to no interaction with the Inquisition, and thus had no reason to protest against it. The Inquisition's support, when it existed, was often more a matter of indifference or lack of awareness rather than genuine approval. The institution's true impact and the extent of its support remain subjects of historical debate. In the towns and cities of Spain, people often found themselves in the middle of a big change. New groups of people who were seen as different started showing up. They were often viewed with suspicion, especially by the local leaders and important people. This happened in places like Andalusia and Aragon, where the newcomers were seen as a threat to the way things had always been done. Religion wasn't always the main reason for the conflicts. In Aragon, for example, the Inquisition was something new and not well received. The people there hadn't really dealt with a formal Inquisition before, so they weren't keen on starting one. In Castile, things were even more complicated. The Castilians had never set up a system to punish people for having different religious beliefs. Their society was very diverse, with influences from folk customs, Islam, and Judaism. These differences didn't usually cause problems that required harsh punishments. So, how did the Spanish people end up accepting a system like the Inquisition, which was so different from what they were used to? A Jesuit named Juan de Mariana, writing at the end of the 1500s, gives us a good idea. He talked about how the Inquisition's methods were seen as very harsh and different from the usual way of doing things. For example, children were punished for their parents' actions, and people couldn't face their accusers or know who was testifying against them. This was all very different from the old ways, and it made people feel like they were losing their freedom. Despite his strong words, Mariana didn't entirely agree with the critics. He noted that some people believed the Inquisition was necessary for the times. The Spanish rulers, Ferdinand and Isabella, were dealing with a lot of problems, including a war against the Muslims in Granada. They felt that strong measures were needed to keep the country together. Ferdinand even told the leaders in Barcelona that he was willing to accept any negative consequences of the Inquisition because he believed it was more important to serve God than to worry about money or taxes. The idea of a crisis was crucial. The Spanish people were told that these tough measures were needed to protect the country. This helped calm down a lot of the protests. People accepted the Inquisition as a necessary evil, even though it went against some of their core beliefs. Some people, like Hernando del Pulgar, a royal secretary, argued that the Inquisition was too harsh and that people should be given a chance to learn and change their beliefs instead of being punished. He pointed out that many conversos, people who had converted from Judaism to Christianity, had never been properly taught about their new faith and were being unfairly punished. Another critic, Juan de Lucena, a humanist and advisor to the king and queen, also spoke out against the Inquisition. He argued that people who had converted out of fear should not be treated as heretics and should be given a chance to understand their new faith through education, not punishment. Even some people within the Inquisition, like the Inquisitor Luis de Paramo, had doubts. They thought that the forced conversion of Jews was not valid, and that the Inquisition's actions against them were wrong and harmful to the Church. In the early years, the main opposition to the Inquisition came from conversos. They tried to get help from the Pope in Rome, but the Spanish rulers put a lot of pressure on the Pope to change his mind. The Pope, Sixtus IV, and his successor, Innocent VIII, tried to make the Inquisition less harsh, but their efforts were limited. The public humiliation caused by the Sanbenitos, special garments worn by those accused of heresy, was another source of criticism. People from both old and new Christian backgrounds found it very oppressive. Spying was another issue that bothered everyone, as it created a climate of fear and mistrust. One of the most dramatic examples of the Inquisition's overreach happened in Cordoba in 1499. A new inquisitor, Diego Rodriguez Lucero, started arresting people on false charges to seize their property. He targeted both conversos and old Christians, creating a lot of fear and anger in the community. Lucero claimed he was fighting a dangerous pro-Jewish movement, but many of his victims were innocent. The royal council eventually stepped in to stop him, but not before he had caused a lot of harm. The Inquisition, which was supposed to be a temporary measure to deal with a crisis, ended up lasting for centuries. Many people, like Mariana and Pulgar, believed that it was too harsh and that it went against the principles of justice. However, those in power made sure that the sense of crisis never really went away, which allowed the Inquisition to continue its work for a very long time. The story of the Spanish Inquisition is one of deep complexity and profound human struggle. As we reach the end, it's important to understand the impact of the Inquisition on the lives of those it touched and the changes it brought about in Spain. In the early 16th century, a man named Lucero caused a great deal of turmoil. He accused the Archbishop of Granada, Hernando de Talavera, of having a synagogue in his palace. This was a serious charge, and Lucero arrested Talavera and his household, including family members and servants. Despite the lack of evidence, the arrested individuals were tortured, and many were forced to denounce the archbishop. However, a rebellion in Cordoba in 1506 put an end to Lucero's reign of terror. The papacy intervened, and Talavera was eventually acquitted and freed in April 1507. Unfortunately, the stress and humiliation took a toll on the old archbishop, and he died shortly after, denouncing Lucero and his accomplices for their cruel actions. Nearly a century later, a historian named Fray José de Sigüenza remembered Talavera fondly. He believed that Talavera's approach to new Christians, or conversos, was compassionate and just. Talavera insisted that these converts should not be treated poorly, and that they should be brought back to the faith through reason and kindness, not through persecution. Fray José lamented that if more prelates had followed Talavera's example, many souls might have been saved from the sects of Moses and Mohammed. Talavera's views were clearly expressed in his Catholic Refutation, where he argued against the idea that Jews and conversos were a specially gifted nation. He supported the use of the death penalty for heresy, but believed that heretics should be corrected with reason and understanding. This tract, however, was later placed on the Index of Forbidden Books in 1559, due to its controversial nature. In 1507, Gonzalo de Oira, a captain general and chronicler, wrote a letter to the king's secretary, Miguel Almazan, protesting the injustices committed by Lucero. He described the damage done by the Inquisition's officials, who had defamed the kingdom, destroyed lives, and committed countless atrocities. This letter, along with the resignation of the Inquisitor General Deza and the appointment of Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, marked the beginning of a shift in the Inquisition's practices. However, the problems did not end there. In Lorena, a new inquisitor named Bravo continued the pattern of abuse, imprisoning wealthy conversos and mistreating their families. The relatives of the prisoners petitioned the crown for help, but there is no record of any censure of Bravo's actions. Similarly, in Jaén, a man named Diego de Algeciras, who had previously worked with Lucero, continued to testify falsely against conversos for a fee, leading to the imprisonment of many innocent people. The abuse often came from the lower ranks of the Inquisition. For example, a notary in Jaén locked a young girl in a room, stripped her naked, and whipped her until she testified against her mother. In Toledo, a receiver of confiscated goods defrauded the Inquisition of 4,000 ducats. Even the doorkeeper and messenger of the Inquisition in Cordoba were known criminals and profiteers. In the Crown of Aragon, old Christians who had initially supported the persecution of conversos began to rally against the Inquisition after the death of Queen Isabella. They met at Monzon in 1510 and 1512 to discuss reforms. The Accord of 1512, signed by King Ferdinand, included limits on the number of inquisitorial familiars, the taxation of the Inquisition, and the trial of inquisitorial officials by secular courts. It also prohibited the confiscation of property that had belonged to the condemned and allowed trade with conversos, as this was beneficial for commerce. When Ferdinand died in 1516, the crown passed to his grandson Charles, who was in Flanders at the time. Charles's arrival in Spain in 1517 brought new hopes for reform. At the courts in Valladolid in 1518, deputies petitioned for changes in the Inquisition's procedures, including the protection of the innocent, the assignment of counsel, and the provision of Mass and sacraments to prisoners. These proposed reforms were championed by Jean Le Sauvage, the king's chancellor. However, the new Inquisitor General, Adrian of Utrecht, opposed these changes, and with the death of Sauvage in July 1518, any hope of significant reform disappeared. In Aragon, Charles initially agreed to a list of reforms in the courts at Saragossa in 1518, but he soon reneged on his promise. When the Inquisition arrested the notary Juan Prat for allegedly falsifying the articles, a constitutional crisis erupted. The deputies and nobility of Aragon refused to disperse until their demands were met, and they threatened to withhold funds from the king. This conflict highlighted the deep tension between the Inquisition and the people it governed. The story of the Spanish Inquisition is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of justice and fairness. It reminds us that the struggle for human rights and dignity is ongoing, and that the lessons of history can guide us in creating a more just society.